Long ago, between two great rivers where reeds swayed and water shimmered, the first cities on earth began to rise. This land, Mesopotamia, would become the stage for humanity's earliest empires, stories, and laws. Before Egypt raised its pyramids or Rome paved its roads, people here were building temples, writing in clay, and dreaming of gods who walked among them. Under torchlight, scribes carved symbols that would echo across centuries. It's a story of invention and ritual, of flood and harvest, of a world both distant and deeply familiar. Can you imagine standing beneath a ziggurat as drums echo through the night air? Let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? Now dim your screen. Let the night grow quiet. The wind sighed across the riverbanks of the Euphrates, stirring dust through the alleys of a city that would one day be called Uruk. Long before its walls were raised, before its temples towered above the plain, the land itself was already preparing to cradle life. Between the Euphrates and the Tigris lay a broad sweep of earth that glimmered with promise. The rivers, fed by distant mountains, carried silt down into the flatlands. Each spring, as the waters swelled and spread, they left behind a thin, fertile skin of soil. To eyes weary from the barren desert beyond, this was a miracle repeated year after year, a strip of green where grain could grow, where flocks could graze, where people could linger instead of wandering. Imagine standing here thousands of years ago, the horizon wide and unbroken, the sky a pale dome of shifting blues, the heat pressing down in waves. To one side, desert stretched in a long, patient silence. To the other, the rivers curled, carrying with them the music of rushing water. In between, reeds rustled, birds wheeled overhead, and the smell of damp earth rose from the banks. It was here, in this fragile balance of water and dry land, that the first seeds of civilization were sown. At first, the people who came to these plains were gatherers and herders. They followed the seasons, their lives moving with the cycles of the rivers. But slowly, gently, something shifted. They began to stay. Perhaps it was the way the soil held the memory of water, making it easier to coax grain from the earth. Perhaps it was the way the rivers carried fish and reeds, offering steady food and shelter. Whatever the cause, huts of mud and reed appeared, fragile at first, then more numerous. Families learned to bend the floods to their will, digging shallow channels to guide the waters, planting barley and wheat where the soil lay richest. The land responded. Fields rippled with green, harvests filled baskets, and granaries swelled with more food than one family alone could consume. And with this abundance came something new, permanence. For the first time, homes were not abandoned when the seasons shifted. Villages endured, and in time, villages grew into towns. Picture such a settlement in the quiet dusk. Smoke rising from clay hearths, the soft bleating of goats, the rustle of woven mats spread across the floor. A woman kneels beside a grinding stone, the sound of grain being crushed into flour, blending with the distant calls of children. The air smells of baking bread, of earth still wet from irrigation canals. All around her, neighbours are close, walls touching walls, lives pressed together in the closeness of the first communities. Life here was not without challenge. The same floods that nourished the fields could also destroy them. A river too high could sweep away crops and homes, while a river too low meant famine. Drought pressed from the edges of the desert, reminding all who lived here that survival depended on balance between water and land, between people and nature, between chance and effort. Yet it was precisely this challenge that shaped the ingenuity of Mesopotamia. To live here meant to adapt, to organize, to plan. And in that planning, seeds of greater things took root. Slowly, villages began to gather around sacred spaces. At the center of many early towns rose a platform, a raised mound of earth or clay, where offerings were laid to unseen powers. The people believed the rivers and the soil were gifts of divine hands, and so they built spaces to honor the unseen. These places of ritual became magnets, drawing together worship, trade, and leadership. A cluster of homes might expand around a shrine until it was no longer a village, but the outline of a city. And with the city came complexity. Not every hand needed to work the fields. Some baked bread, others shaped clay, others fished the rivers or tended goats. Skills multiplied, knowledge spread. In the glow of firelight, stories began to take form. Myths of gods and heroes, of floods and creation. The first steps towards civilization had been taken, quietly and almost without notice. But pause here for a moment and imagine walking through one of these early towns. The paths are narrow, trodden by bare feet. The walls are low, made of mud brick that crumbles under your touch. A potter sits at his wheel, shaping vessels for storing oil and grain. Children chase each other through the alleys, their laughter mingling with the bleating of animals. Somewhere nearby, a priest tends the sacred fire, murmuring prayers into the smoke. It is both simple and profound, a world on the cusp of change, aware only that life here feels different, more rooted than anywhere else. Mesopotamia is often called the cradle of civilization, but think of that word, cradle, a place of protection, of beginnings, of first steps. Just as an infant rests in the arms of a cradle before learning to walk, humanity rested here in the curve of the rivers before rising to build the first cities. This land did not give birth to civilization all at once. It rocked it gently, steadily, until the time came for it to stand. And as the generations passed, the cradle grew crowded. Villages swelled into towns, towns stretched into cities, and the cities themselves began to gaze outward. Questions arose. Who would lead, and how? How could one group of people share water with another? What happened when floods failed, or when neighbors quarreled? The answers to these questions would shape the next chapter of Mesopotamia's story. The rivers still whispered their song, flowing endlessly between mountains and gulf. And the people, listening to those waters, began to dream of permanence, of greatness, of names that would echo like the symbols pressed into clay. The wind carried dust across the plain, through the alleys and markets, as the first true city began to stir. Its name was Uruk. The wind carried the dust of the plain toward the walls of Uruk, but long before those stones were lifted into place, the story of Mesopotamia was one of reed huts and clay. At first glance, those early dwellings were fragile things. Walls woven from bundles of reed, coated with mud, roofs low and simple. They bent in the wind and sagged with the weight of rain, yet they carried a remarkable truth. Permanence. Where once families had moved with the herds, now they lingered beside the rivers, building homes that remained standing from one season to the next. The hut was more than shelter, it was a promise. Within its walls, fires crackled, bread baked, stories were told. Children grew up in the same place their parents had lived, learning the patterns of sowing and harvest. of rising floods and quiet summers. Slowly, the ground beneath those huts grew layered with memory. Ashes from countless fires, shards of broken pots, the footprints of generations pressed into earth. From these clusters of reed and clay, something extraordinary began to take shape. Life demanded more than food and shelter. It demanded meaning. As communities grew, so too did their awareness of powers beyond themselves. The river that gave water could also bring ruin. The sun that ripened grain could also scorch it. The cycle of nature was both generous and perilous, and so people sought ways to honor the forces they could not control. At first, offerings were simple: a handful of grain, a small clay figurine, a prayer whispered to the river. But in time, these offerings gathered into spaces set apart, small sanctuaries where the unseen might dwell, a raised mound of earth, a hut kept for ritual alone. Neighbors brought their gifts there, gathering at dusk with food, incense, and quiet song. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these early shrines. The air is thick with the smell of burning reeds. Smoke curls upward, pale against the evening sky. People approach slowly, their faces marked by both reverence and fear, for here was the place where earth met the divine. Clay figurines rest in rows, tiny forms of animals, women, and gods. A priest or priestess tends a small flame, their hands moving with practiced care. Around you, the hum of voices rises, chants repeated softly, as though the rhythm itself could sway the will of the unseen. In these spaces, villages became more than collections of huts. They became communities bound by shared ritual. And with shared ritual came the seeds of leadership. Someone had to tend the shrine, organize the offerings, remember the prayers. Slowly, a new figure emerged: the temple guardian, the mediator between people and gods. With their presence, the shrine grew in importance, and the community drew ever closer to its center. The structures themselves began to change. What had once been a hut of reeds became a platform of packed earth. Later, walls of sun-dried brick rose around it, strong enough to endure the seasons. Decorative cones of clay, pressed into the walls, caught the light of the sun. These were not homes but symbols, statements of permanence, of power, of the unseen brought down into the heart of the village. And so, step by step, the humble huts of Mesopotamia gave way to temples. Not vast towers, not yet the great ziggurats of later days, but spaces large enough to gather a crowd, to host rituals, to remind every villager of forces greater than themselves. In these temples, religion and community blended until they were inseparable. The rhythm of daily life beat to the pulse of ritual, offerings at dawn, chants at dusk, festivals in between. Think of the festivals: the smell of roasting grain and meat, the sound of flutes carved from reed, the shimmer of dancers moving in time to the drum. People who once lived scattered now pressed shoulder to shoulder, their voices raised together. Children clung to their mothers, eyes wide at the spectacle. Farmers left their fields, fishermen their nets, potters their wheels, all drawn into the circle of community by the call of the temple. And yet, the temple was not only a place of worship, it became the beating heart of early Mesopotamian society. Within its walls, offerings of grain and oil were stored, not only for the gods, but for the people. Priests became keepers of both ritual and resource, distributing food in lean years, guiding irrigation in times of need. Authority and belief were intertwined. To question the temple was to question the gods themselves. Picture a scene inside: clay jars stacked in rows, filled with grain from countless harvests. A scribe, reed stylus in hand, presses marks into wet clay to record the offerings. His fingers are quick, his lines steady, though he may not know that his simple marks will one day be called writing. A young priest counts jars by torchlight, her lips moving silently as she prays over each one. Outside, farmers wait patiently for their share, their eyes lifting often to the painted walls of the temple, as if to remind themselves that what they receive is a gift of the divine. This too shaped the cities to come. As temples grew, they drew craftsmen, traders, and officials into their orbit. The potter who made vessels for offerings, the weaver who wove cloth for priests, the trader who brought incense from distant lands, all found their place within the shadow of sacred walls. What began as reed huts had become something larger, more organized, more enduring. But the temple's presence also carried tension. Its power reached far beyond prayer, guiding who had food, who had land, who had favor. Priests and priestesses became figures of influence, and with influence came conflict. Families who once shared the work of farming now looked to leaders to decide disputes, to settle quarrels, to measure fairness. The temple, in its rising walls of brick, became both the symbol and source of order. As centuries passed, these early temples rose higher, layer upon layer, rebuilt and enlarged with each generation. What had once been a shrine of mud grew into great platforms that towered above the plain. From miles away, a traveller could see them rising like mountains of brick against the horizon. They were not yet the vast Ziggurats of later Babylon, but already they spoke of ambition, the human desire to reach upward, to touch the heavens. And perhaps, as you picture them in the fading light, you can feel the awe of those who gathered there. For here was the first architecture of power, the first monuments that claimed not only space but meaning. Where huts had once sheltered families, temples now sheltered an entire people's hope. Beneath their walls, daily life continued. Farmers bent over barley fields, children splashed in irrigation canals, merchants bartered in crowded markets. But above it all, the temple loomed, a reminder that life was not only about survival, it was about order, about belief, about the unseen powers that bound earth and sky together. The journey from reed huts to temples was not swift. It unfolded over generations, slow as the meandering rivers. Yet by the time Uruk began to rise, its temples already stood at the heart of life, shaping how people saw themselves and the world around them. The rivers still flooded, the fields still needed tending, but in the growing cities of Mesopotamia, the rhythm of life now pulsed to a deeper beat. The beat of drums in the temple court, the whisper of prayers in the sacred halls, the echo of footsteps on brick. And from these temples, from this fusion of faith and community, a new vision of civilization was born. A vision that would soon spill beyond sacred walls into streets and markets, into palaces and schools, into laws and legends. For Uruk was waiting, and with it, the dawn of cities unlike any the world had ever seen. The sun rose golden over the flat plains, its light shimmering off the waters of the Euphrates. Far in the distance, a new silhouette broke the horizon. Not the low roofs of reed huts, not the modest shrines of earlier days, but walls of mud brick rising higher than the eye expected, enclosing a city that seemed to pulse with life. This was Uruk. Uruk was unlike anything the world had yet known. By the 4th millennium BCE, it had become the largest city on Earth, home to tens of thousands of people. From the desert's edge, a traveller approaching its gates would hear the hum of life long before stepping inside. The bray of donkeys laden with goods, the call of vendors at the marketplace, the steady rhythm of hammers striking stone. Step closer, and you would see walls stretching for miles, built of countless bricks baked hard by the sun. Towers rose above them, a symbol of both protection and pride. Within lay a maze of narrow streets, bustling with people from dawn until the stars returned. Uruk was more than a cluster of homes. It was a living organism. Its heart was the temple district, where towering structures stood as both houses of gods and centers of power. Here rose the great white temple, gleaming against the sky atop its raised platform, visible to all who entered the city. Beneath it, priests and priestesses conducted rituals, stored offerings, and managed the vast resources that flowed into their keeping. Around it, life radiated outward, each street and square connected to the presence of the divine. But to walk through Uruk was to see more than religion. The city was a symphony of human endeavor. In one quarter, potters turned their wheels, shaping jars and bowls that would be traded across the land. In another, smiths hammered copper, sparks leaping into the air. Weavers sat at looms, their hands moving swiftly, while merchants haggled loudly over baskets of dates, fish, and grain. The air was thick with smells: freshly baked bread, roasting meat, the smoke of torches, and the faint tang of clay dust. The market was a world of its own. Picture the wide square at midday, the sun blazing overhead as merchants spread their goods on woven mats. Barley, wheat, and lentils lay in neat piles. Jars of oil glistened in the light. Shepherds drove their goats into pens, their calls mingling with the bleating of animals. Traders from distant lands arrived with strange treasures: timber from the mountains, shells from the sea, stones carved into beads and seals. Here, exchange was more than survival, it was connection. Each bargain struck was a thread binding Uruk to lands far beyond its walls. And yet, amidst the noise and bustle, there was order. Scribes, seated with clay tablets and reed styluses, recorded the flow of goods. They pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, noting who had delivered grain, who had purchased wool, who owed what to whom. These records were more than lists. They were the foundation of accountability, of trust in a city too large to rely on memory alone. Through them, writing itself began to take shape, transforming from mere tallies into symbols of speech, stories, and law. But Uruk was not only a place of trade and record, it was a place of myth. Legends told of kings who ruled with the strength of lions, of heroes who battled monsters at the edge of the world. Chief among them was Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king whose deeds would echo in story for thousands of years. To the people of Uruk, these tales were not distant fantasies but reflections of their city's greatness. Gilgamesh was Uruk itself, mighty, ambitious, flawed, but determined to leave a mark upon the world. Imagine, for a moment, walking through Uruk as dusk approaches. The streets glow with the light of torches. Music drifts from a courtyard. Flutes and drums keeping time as dancers spin. Children chase one another through the alleys, their laughter ringing above the hum of the crowd. At the temple, priests ascend the steps to offer prayers, their chants echoing across the rooftops. Above it all, the stars emerge, glittering over a city that does not sleep. a city alive with voices and dreams. What made Uruk extraordinary was not only its size, but its complexity. Here was a world in miniature, a tapestry of roles and relationships. Farmers still worked the fields beyond the walls, channeling river water into their crops. Their grain filled the storerooms that fed the city. Craftsmen turned raw materials into tools and ornaments. Traders carried Uruk's goods outward and returned with the wealth of distant lands. Priests guided ritual and resource alike, while rulers defended the walls and proclaimed the city's might. Each thread was woven into a whole, each life bound to the rhythm of a city greater than any one person. Yet greatness carried its burdens. Uruk's walls spoke of protection, but also of fear. Beyond them lay rivals and enemies, other towns and cities rising in the same fertile land, each vying for water, fields, and power. Within the city, too, tensions stirred. Who held true authority? The king who led the army, or the priests who guarded the favor of the gods? Who decided how grain was shared, or whose name would be carved in stone? These questions lingered in the streets, even as festivals and rituals kept the city bound in unity. Still, the city grew. By 3000 BCE, Uruk stretched farther than the eye could see, its population swelling, its walls reaching outward. Travelers from afar spoke of its grandeur, its temples gleaming in the sun, its markets filled with wonders. For many, to see Uruk was to glimpse the very future of humanity, a place where stone and clay had been shaped into permanence, where memory itself was preserved on tablets of earth, where myth and power intertwined. And perhaps, standing at the gates, you would feel that same awe, the hum of thousands of voices, the sight of towering walls, the knowledge that here, in this place between rivers, humanity had built something entirely new, a city that was not merely a cluster of homes, but a world entire, alive with faith, ambition, and the restless spirit of invention. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of drums from the temple steps, the laughter of merchants, the cry of animals, the scratch of styluses in clay. Uruk breathed, and with its breath, the story of civilization moved forward. From reed huts had come temples, from temples had come cities, and from cities like Uruk would come the next steps, law, empire, and legends that would never die. In the heart of Uruk, the marketplace bustled with trade, and temples swelled with offerings. Yet amidst the hum of voices and the shuffle of feet, a quieter sound carried just as much power, the scratch of a reed stylus against soft clay. Long before the stories of kings and gods were carved into stone, writing began here in the simplest of forms. Farmers brought their barley, potters their jars, shepherds their sheep, and someone needed to keep account. At first, small clay tokens sufficed, each token shaped like a grain, a jar, or an animal, a symbol that stood for what was exchanged. But as the city grew, so did the complexity of its needs. Tokens multiplied, and soon they were pressed into clay envelopes called bulli, sealed with impressions that told what was inside. Yet even that was not enough. And so, almost by accident, the world's first writing was born. Instead of carrying tokens, scribes began to press their symbols directly into wet clay. A wedge for grain, a circle for a jar, a line for a sheep. These marks spoke not in sound, but in meaning, a silent language carved into earth. Over time, the symbols grew in number and complexity. A system of pictures became a system of ideas, and then, slowly, a system of words. The stylus was their instrument, a simple reed cut to a sharp edge, its tip pressed again and again into clay to form wedge-shaped strokes. The very shape of writing was born from the material itself, soft clay yielding to sharp reed, drying in the sun until thought became permanent. This was cuneiform, from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge. Imagine a scribe at his work. He sits cross-legged on the floor, a lump of damp clay balanced in his palm. In his other hand, the stylus hovers, then presses downward, leaving its mark with swift certainty. The room smells of earth and smoke, the flicker of a torch casting shadows across the wall. Around him, rows of tablets already rest, drying in the warm air, each one a small treasury of knowledge. Scribes were the memory of the city. They recorded harvests, debts, and offerings, but also contracts, prayers, hymns, and stories. To learn their art was no small feat. Boys chosen for training spent years in scribal schools, called adubas, or tablet houses. There, under the stern eyes of masters, they learned to shape thousands of signs, to recite them, to copy them endlessly until the marks became second nature. Discipline was strict. Mistakes meant harsh correction. Yet those who endured gained entry into one of the most respected callings in Mesopotamian life. Picture such a school, the scrape of stylus on clay filling the air, the murmur of boys chanting signs aloud. A teacher strides between them, correcting a stroke here, a line there, sometimes raising his voice in impatience, sometimes pausing to explain the meaning of a sign. In the corner, a pile of discarded tablets crumbles into dust, the mistakes of yesterday already forgotten. On the teacher's table rests a finished tablet, its signs sharp and neat, a model for all to follow. Through writing, the city gained a voice that could endure. Words no longer vanished on the wind. Instructions could be preserved, contracts enforced, prayers carried to the gods, not just in breath, but in lasting form. Even memory itself was transformed. What once depended on human recall now lay inscribed in clay, waiting to be read again and again. The power of this was immense. A farmer might argue over how much grain he had delivered, but the tablet spoke with authority. A temple might wish to preserve a hymn, and the written signs carried its song forward. Kings could command not only by speech, but by script, their decrees pressed into clay and carried across the land. In a world still fragile, still bound to the rhythms of flood and drought, writing offered permanence, a solidity beyond the reach of memory. But writing also reached beyond the practical. From its earliest days, it carried the voice of imagination. On clay tablets, scribes began to copy not just accounts, but myths. Stories of gods and heroes found their way into script. Tales of creation, of great floods, of kings who sought immortality. Each sign, each wedge pressed into clay, carried not only meaning, but wonder. Through writing, the thoughts of one generation whispered into the ears of the next. Imagine a priest reading aloud by torchlight, his voice echoing through the temple. In his hands rests a tablet inscribed with an ancient hymn. Around him, worshippers bow their heads, their minds filled with visions of gods born from sea and sky. The words he reads were pressed into clay long before his time, yet here they are again, alive on his lips. Writing had given the city not only memory, but continuity, a bridge across time. The clay tablets themselves were humble things, fragile and small, yet thousands survived, buried beneath the sands, waiting to be uncovered by later hands. Some record the simplest of things, a list of sheep, a tally of jars. Others carry the weight of philosophy and prayer. Together, they form a chorus of voices from long ago, each sign a heartbeat preserved. And consider this: writing did not remain still. Over centuries, the signs evolved, growing more abstract, more flexible. What began as pictures became syllables, then words, until scribes could capture the sound of speech itself. With this step, human thought leapt forward. Language was no longer confined to voice and memory. It could be captured, shaped, carried across generations. In Uruk, the written word became as vital as the temple or the market. It was woven into every corner of life, into trade and worship, into law and legend. To hear the scratch of stylus on clay was to hear the future unfolding. Pause for a moment and imagine yourself holding such a tablet. It is small, heavy in your palm, the clay cool and rough against your skin. The signs cover its surface in neat rows, each wedge a decision made by a steady hand thousands of years ago. You cannot read it perhaps, but you know it means something, that it carries a voice across time. That voice whispers still, faint yet enduring, like the rivers that shaped the land. The rise of writing was more than invention. It was a revolution of thought. Through cuneiform, the people of Mesopotamia gave shape to memory, power, and imagination. And from their tablets, countless cultures after would learn. The city of Uruk still bustled, its walls still echoed with life. But now, within its temples and schools, within its markets and palaces, the written word pulsed like a hidden current, carrying the thoughts of many into the hands of a few, and then outward again into the life of the city. And from those tablets, from that steady scratching of reed into clay, another world would soon emerge, of gods, myths, and towering temples that would pierce the sky. The clay tablet, pressed with wedges of prayer and hymn, lay cooling in the dim light of the temple. Outside, the city of Uruk hummed with its daily rhythm, but within these sacred walls, the air was hushed. Smoke from burning incense drifted upward in curling trails, carrying with it the voices of those who prayed. To the people of Mesopotamia, the world was alive with divine presence. Every river, every field, every star that shone in the night sky was tied to a god or goddess. The Tigris and Euphrates themselves were thought to flow with divine will, their floods and droughts the moods of powers unseen. The rising sun was Shamash, god of justice and truth. The moon was Nana, whose cool glow guided the night. Ishtar brought passion and war, while Enlil ruled the winds and the storms. Over all stood Anu, the great father of the heavens. Life was fragile in Mesopotamia, balanced on the shifting cycles of nature. To secure harmony, people turned constantly to the gods. Festivals, sacrifices, and daily rituals filled the calendar, each one a plea for balance, rain at the right time, sun in the right measure, protection from disease, safety from flood. The gods were not distant abstractions, but ever-present forces, quick to bless or punish. To live in Mesopotamia was to live in conversation with the divine. Myth gave shape to this relationship. Around the fires at night, or in the cool courtyards at dawn, stories were told of beginnings, of battles among gods, of heroes who bridged the gap between mortal and immortal. One tale spoke of Tiamat, the primeval sea, whose chaos was split in two by Marduk to form the heavens and the earth. Another told of Inanna's descent into the underworld, a journey of loss and renewal, that echoed the cycles of crops and seasons. And always, these stories reflected the human condition: struggle, hope, longing, and the search for meaning. Picture a gathering at dusk when the day's labour is done. Families sit in the open air, the last warmth of the sun fading from the mud brick walls. An elder begins to speak, his voice steady and rich. Children lean forward, their eyes wide, while adults close theirs, letting the rhythm of words wash over them. In his tale, gods argue, kings rise and fall, rivers surge, storms rage. For a while, listeners are carried beyond their hardships, drawn into a realm where divine struggles mirror their own. The story ends, but its echo lingers, woven into the very fabric of how people understood their world. These myths were not only spoken, they were carved into the life of the city itself. Rising from the plains, immense temple towers embodied the link between earth and sky. These were the Ziggurats, tiered structures built of mud brick, their massive steps climbing upward like mountains crafted by human hands. To stand before one was to feel both small and connected, as if the very air trembled with sacred energy. The ziggurat was not a temple itself, but the foundation upon which temples stood. At its summit, a shrine housed the god's presence, a place where only priests and chosen attendants might enter. To reach it required climbing stairways that wound upward, a symbolic journey from the earthly to the divine. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight bathed its bricks in gold. At night, the torches along its steps flickered like stars come down to earth. Imagine approaching such a ziggurat at twilight. Its base looms vast before you, stretching wider than fields of grain. The bricks, laid one upon another, carry the labour of generations. As you draw closer, the scale overwhelms, tiers rising higher and higher until the shrine at the top seems to touch the sky. Around you, crowds gather, some bringing offerings, others simply standing in awe. Drums beat in the distance, deep and slow, echoing like the heartbeat of the city. Smoke from altars drifts upward, mingling with the gathering stars. Within the temple, at the summit, rituals unfold with solemn precision. Priests wash and anoint the statue of the god, treating it as a living being, clothing it in fine garments, offering bread and wine, speaking prayers in hushed tones. To the people below, these acts ensured the god's favour. For if the gods turned away, famine, disease or war might follow. But if they were pleased, the city would flourish, its walls strong, its harvests abundant, its people secure. Ziggurats were more than monuments to faith. They were statements of power. To build one required immense resources, thousands of workers shaping and laying millions of bricks, overseen by rulers who claimed divine mandate. The sheer size of these towers proclaimed the city's strength, its wealth, its closeness to the gods. For travellers approaching from afar, the ziggurat was the first sight of the city, a beacon across the flat plain, a declaration that here, civilization had reached for the heavens. Yet for all their grandeur, ziggurats also anchored daily life. Markets clustered at their bases, courtyards filled with worshippers bringing offerings of grain, oil, and animals. Musicians played flutes and lyres, their melodies weaving through the murmur of the crowd. Children darted between stalls, chasing each other while parents bartered and priests called out blessings. The sacred and the ordinary coexisted here, intertwined in the shadow of brick steps that reached to the sky. In the quiet of night, when the crowd had dispersed and only a few torches flickered along the stairways, the Ziggurats stood in stillness. Against the dark sky, its silhouette rose like a mountain, silent yet alive with meaning. For the people of Mesopotamia, it was not just stone and clay. It was a ladder between earth and heaven, a reminder that their lives were bound to forces greater than themselves. Through gods, myths, and ziggurats, Mesopotamia built more than cities. It built a worldview. Each prayer, each story, each brick laid upon brick was part of a grand conversation with the divine. The people's labor gave them shelter, but their faith gave them purpose. Together, they created a culture where survival was not only physical, but spiritual, where the rhythms of flood and harvest were echoed in the rhythms of ritual and myth. And so the city thrived, both in body and in spirit. Within its walls, scribes pressed stories into clay, priests sang hymns to the gods, and children grew up under the shadow of towers that seemed to touch the stars. Their world was fragile, but it was also luminous, filled with meaning carved into brick, told in story, sung in prayer. The rivers still flowed, the fields still ripened, but now, above it all, the gods watched from their shrines on high, and the people, looking upward at the ziggurats glowing in the light of dawn, felt themselves part of something vast and enduring. The ziggurat rose above the plain like a stairway to heaven, but below its shadow another kind of power was taking shape. Temples connected the people to the gods, yet cities of such size and ambition could not thrive on ritual alone. They required leadership, figures to command, to organize, to defend. And so, from the dust of villages and shrines, kingship was born. In Mesopotamia, kings were never merely men. They were chosen, it was believed, by the gods themselves. Their rule carried divine approval, their victories proof of heavenly favor. To wear the crown was to walk a delicate path between mortal and divine, responsible not only for defending the city, but for keeping harmony between heaven and earth. Imagine the king's procession through Uruk. The narrow streets swell with people as drums announce his coming. Soldiers clear the way, their spears glinting in the sun. Behind them rides the king, seated in a chariot pulled by donkeys, his garments woven in bright patterns, his crown gleaming with metal and gems. Children strain to see over the shoulders of their parents, while elders bow their heads in reverence. To the crowd, this is no ordinary man. It is the living vessel of divine authority, the one who ensures the city's prosperity and safety. Yet kingship was more than ceremony. Behind the palace walls, leaders faced endless decisions. Should the city extend its irrigation canals to claim new farmland? Should its soldiers march against a rival town? How should justice be delivered when neighbors quarreled? Each choice shaped not only the city's present, but its survival. A weak king could bring ruin, a strong one, glory. And where kings ruled, queens often stood close beside them, their presence woven into the fabric of power. Though our records are fragmentary, we know of women who held influence in the palaces and temples of Mesopotamia. Some acted as priestesses, bridging the sacred and the political. Others managed estates, commanded servants, and sponsored rituals that displayed both wealth and devotion. Queens, too, carried the aura of divine connection, their marriages binding families, their presence ensuring continuity. Together, king and queen embodied the city's stability, two figures at the heart of both palace and temple, guardians of earthly order beneath heavenly gaze. But power was not only shown in crowns and robes, it was written into stone and clay, etched into the very landscape of the city. The walls of Uruk became the most enduring symbol of kingship. Rising tall and wide, they encircled the city like an embrace of brick. To build them required the labor of thousands, each brick molded by hand, each row stacked beneath the unrelenting sun. Pause a moment and picture those walls. They stretch farther than the eye can follow, their surface glowing in the heat of midday. Gates tower above the streets, their wooden beams reinforced with bronze. Watchmen stand along the top, scanning the horizon for signs of danger. From outside, the walls proclaim strength. From within, they promise safety. For the people of Uruk, to live inside those walls was to feel secure, protected not only by soldiers, but by the will of the gods. The walls were also symbols of pride. They told the story of a city that had risen from reed huts to temples, from villages to a vast metropolis. Travellers approaching from the plains could see them gleaming in the distance, a promise that within lay a world unlike any other. Markets, palaces, shrines, and the heartbeat of civilization itself. In time, the very memory of Uruk's walls would be carried into legend, praised in the opening lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where they are described as mighty enough to awe even the gods. Life within those walls thrived. The palace became a center of authority, where scribes recorded decrees and officials oversaw irrigation, trade, and justice. Courtyards rang with the sound of messengers arriving, their voices urgent with news from distant fields or rival towns. In the evenings, banquets were held, music echoing through halls adorned with painted walls. Guests reclined on woven mats, drinking wine as musicians plucked lyres, their songs praising both gods and rulers. Yet kingship was never secure. Rivalries stirred beyond the city, and even within, challenges could arise. A drought might lead to hunger and unrest. A failed campaign might weaken loyalty. Kings walked a narrow path, always seeking to balance force with favor, authority with generosity. The temple lent divine legitimacy, but the people demanded protection and prosperity in return. In quieter moments, we might imagine a king standing atop the walls at sunset. The city stretches below him, streets filled with merchants, children chasing one another, priests tending sacred fires. Beyond the walls, fields of grain ripple in the evening wind, canals glittering as they carry the last light of the day. And farther still lies the desert, silent and vast, a reminder of the fragility of life without the rivers. The king lifts his eyes to the ziggurat rising above the rooftops, its shrine catching the glow of dusk. Perhaps he whispers a prayer, for he knows that even a king cannot rule without the favor of the gods. Queens too played roles in such moments. Some led ceremonies at temples, dressed in garments of gold and lapis lazuli. Others gave offerings of food and wine to the gods, their gestures reminding all who watched that the city's abundance flowed from divine generosity. In inscriptions, their names sometimes appear beside their husbands, their influence hinted at in fragments that speak of devotion, wisdom, and leadership. Though the records may be faint, their presence was real, woven into the life of court and city, remembered in the patterns of history. Together, kings, queens, and walls formed the triad of Mesopotamian power. Human rulers, divine approval, and the stone that made their authority visible. To live in Uruk, or any great Mesopotamian city, was to feel these forces constantly, whether in the echo of a king's decree, the presence of a queen at ritual, or the shadow of walls stretching above. The rivers still flowed, the temples still thrummed with prayers. But now, power had a human face, a crown of woven metal, a voice that could command armies and decree laws. The city had grown beyond shrines and markets. It had become a kingdom, its destiny shaped not only by gods, but by the choices of those who ruled. And from this mingling of faith and power, myth and stone, a legend would soon rise, of a king whose story would outlast the walls themselves, carried in song and clay through thousands of years. His name was Gilgamesh. Upon the mighty walls of Uruk, tall as mountains and strong as the will of gods, walked a king whose name would echo through time. His story was not only carved into clay, but carried on the lips of storytellers across centuries, passed from firelight to firelight, from temple to temple. His name was Gilgamesh. The people of Uruk praised his strength but feared his pride. 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal, he towered above other men in both stature and ambition. He was restless, bold, and unyielding, building great walls and temples, yet ruling with a hand too heavy for his people's comfort. The gods, hearing their cries, decided to send him a companion, a balance to his unchecked power. And so Enkidu was formed, shaped not in a palace but in the wild. A man of nature, clothed in animal skins, his hair uncut, his strength as raw as the beasts he ran with. At first he lived apart, drinking with gazelles, knowing no city walls. But when he was brought to Uruk, he stood as Gilgamesh's equal, and the two clashed in a fierce contest that shook the very streets. Neither won. Instead, through the struggle, they saw in each other what they lacked, and from that moment on, they became brothers. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu sought adventures beyond the safety of Uruk. They marched into the cedar forests, sacred groves guarded by the monstrous Humbaba. The air there was thick with the scent of resin, the trees towering so high their tops seemed to pierce the clouds. With courage and cunning, the two heroes struck Humbaba down, their victory filling Uruk with pride. Later, when Ishtar, goddess of love and war, sought Gilgamesh's hand, he rejected her, and in her fury, she sent the bull of heaven to punish him. Once again, Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought side by side, slaying the beast as the earth trembled beneath its fall. But joy turned to sorrow, for such defiance could not go unanswered. The gods decreed that Enkidu must die, and his strength, once equal to Gilgamesh's, ebbed away like water spilling from a cracked jar. Gilgamesh watched helplessly as his companion faded, and when Enkidu breathed his last, grief overwhelmed him. Imagine the silence that fell over Uruk. The drums stilled, the laughter hushed. In the palace, the mighty king wept like a child, his cries echoing through the halls. For all his strength, for all his divine blood, Gilgamesh could not save the one he loved most. And so began his great quest, the search not for victory, but for meaning, for a way to escape the fate that claims all mortals. Gilgamesh left Uruk behind, traveling through deserts where the wind cut like knives, across mountains where scorpions stood guard, into darkness where no light could follow. His journey carried him to the edge of the world, to the waters of death, and beyond. At last, he found Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood sent by the gods to cleanse the earth. Utnapishtim told him the tale, how he had built an ark, gathered animals, and endured the storm that swallowed the world. The gods, moved by his obedience, granted him eternal life. But for Gilgamesh, there was no such gift. The old man told him plainly, immortality is not for kings, not for heroes, but for the gods alone. Still, Utnapishtim offered hope. At the bottom of the sea grew a plant of renewal, one that could restore youth. Gilgamesh dove into the waters, wrestled the currents, and seized the plant. At last it seemed he had won a treasure to defy death. But as he rested on his journey home, a serpent rose from the depths and stole it away. Watching the snake slither off, shedding its skin as a sign of rebirth, Gilgamesh realized his quest was in vain. Empty-handed, he returned to Uruk. Yet as he stood upon its towering walls, gazing over the city his people had built, the streets alive with children, the markets filled with voices, the temples rising to the sky, he understood, though he could not live forever, his works, his city, and his story would endure. In them he would remain, his name carried forward long after his flesh had turned to dust. The tale of Gilgamesh is not merely a story of a king, it is a story of humanity, of friendship's joy and grief, of the search for meaning in the face of mortality, of the truth that our greatest legacy is not eternal life, but the marks we leave behind, the walls we build, the stories we tell, the love we share. Even now, as we whisper his name, Gilgamesh walks again. Through clay tablets buried for millennia, through stories passed from voice to voice, his quest endures. It is our quest too, for all who live must ask, how shall we be remembered? The night deepens. The torches of Uruk flicker in the distance, and somewhere, in the silence of clay tablets lying beneath the sand, the king's story waits, still speaking across the ages. The story of Gilgamesh carried the dreams of kings and gods, but beneath the towers and legends lay the true foundation of Mesopotamia, the earth itself. For without the fields of grain and the waters of the rivers, there would have been no temples, no palaces, no walls of Uruk. Civilization rested on the quiet labor of those who bent their backs to the soil. The Tigris and Euphrates were both gift and challenge. Each spring, snow melt from distant mountains swelled their currents, spilling over the banks, flooding the plains. When the waters receded, they left behind dark, fertile silt, rich with life. Yet the floods were unpredictable. Some years they came too high, sweeping away crops and homes. Other years they fell too low, leaving the fields cracked and thirsty. To live here was to live in conversation with the rivers, watching their moods, bending them to human need. And bend them the people did. From the earliest days, villagers dug small channels to guide water into their plots. Over time, these channels became vast networks of irrigation canals, branching like veins across the land. Farmers organized themselves into groups, each responsible for maintaining a stretch of canal, each dependent on the others. Together, they diverted rivers into fields of barley and wheat, ensuring harvests even when the rains failed. Picture a morning in the fields, the sun just rising, painting the canals with gold. Men and women move along the banks, repairing dikes with clay, clearing reeds from the channels. Their feet sink into the damp earth as they guide the water toward the waiting crops. In the distance, the fields stretch in waves of green, barley heads swaying in the breeze. The air smells of wet soil, warm straw, and the faint sweetness of ripening grain. Birds wheel overhead, their cries mingling with the calls of farmers as they work. Barley was the lifeblood of Mesopotamia. From it came bread, the daily sustenance of rich and poor alike. It was baked in clay ovens, its aroma filling the courtyards of homes. Crushed into flour, it thickened stews. Soaked and fermented, it became beer, a drink as common as water. Wheat too was grown, though more delicate, requiring careful tending. Lentils, beans and chickpeas added richness to the diet, while date palms lined the fields, their fruit sweetening meals and their trunks providing timber. Goats and sheep grazed along the canal edges, their milk turned to cheese, their wool spun into thread. Life in the fields was hard, but it had its rhythms. In spring, the water was guided and seeds were sown. Summer brought long days of tending, of weeding and watching the canals. Autumn meant harvest, sickles flashing in the sun, stalks bundled into sheaves, carried on donkey back to the threshing floors. There, grain was beaten free, winnowed in the wind, and stored in clay jars for the months ahead. Winter brought quieter work, repairing tools, mending canals, weaving baskets to hold the next harvest. Imagine a harvest day at its height. The fields hum with voices, whole families working side by side. Children chase each other between the rows, laughing as they gather stray stalks. Women sing as they bind sheaves with twine. Men cut steadily, their movements practiced, their foreheads shining with sweat. The air is thick with the scent of straw and dust, with the warmth of the sun at its zenith. At midday, they pause beneath the shade of palms, sharing bread, cheese, and cool water, their laughter drifting across the plain. In these moments, the weight of survival eases, replaced by the simple joy of labor shared. But farming also demanded vigilance. A broken canal could ruin a season's crop. A sudden drought could empty jars before winter was done. Too much salt left by irrigation could poison the soil, forcing farmers to abandon old plots and carve out new ones. The land was generous, but it required respect and constant care. Communities grew around this shared labor. Villages and towns organized themselves not only by kinship, but by canal. Neighbors depended on each other to keep the water flowing, to settle disputes, to plan for the future. It was here, in the cooperation demanded by irrigation, that the first stirrings of law and governance were born. For how could one family claim more than its share of water without angering all the rest? How could disputes be resolved without order? The rivers, silent and unyielding, forced people into agreement, teaching them the necessity of structure. And so, even the fields were bound to the temples and palaces. Priests and officials recorded harvests on clay, oversaw distribution, and stored grain in vast granaries to guard against famine. The rhythm of the soil was woven into the rhythm of power. To serve the gods was to ensure the canals ran smoothly. To obey the king was to guard the harvest. Faith, authority, and survival all sprang from the same fertile ground. In the quiet of evening, after the work was done, families gathered in their courtyards. The smell of stewing lentils and roasting meat rose into the air. Children played with clay toys shaped like animals. Elders told stories, their voices soft beneath the stars. Perhaps a mother sang as she kneaded dough, her song rising above the crackle of the oven fire. These were the small, human moments upon which the great cities rested. The comfort of food, the warmth of company, the steady return of seasons. And always, in the distance, the rivers flowed. Their waters gleamed in the moonlight, whispering as they wound their way toward the sea. They carried both life and danger, blessing and curse. The people of Mesopotamia learned to listen, to bend but not defy, to live in balance with the currents that sustain them. It is easy to look upon the towering ziggurats, the great walls, the myths carved into clay, and forget that beneath it all lay the soil and the water. But the Mesopotamians knew. Every temple feast was fed by barley. Every tablet recording a debt was written in terms of grain. Every king's glory rested on the harvests brought in by countless hands. The fields of grain were more than food. They were life itself, the quiet foundation upon which all else was built. In their swaying stalks, one could see the rhythm of the universe, birth, growth, harvest, and rest. And in the rivers that nourished them, one could hear the eternal song of Mesopotamia, the song that whispered of both fragility and abundance, of toil and of hope. The sun set over the fields, casting long shadows across the canals. Farmers gathered their tools, their donkeys laden with baskets of grain. Smoke rose from distant hearths as the city walls caught the last light of day. And above it all, the ziggurat gleamed, a reminder that in every loaf of bread, in every jar of beer, in every stalk of barley, there was both the labour of human hands and the favour of the gods. The fields of barley swayed in the wind, the rivers murmured their eternal song, and the cities of Sumer thrived under the watchful eyes of their gods. But the balance of Mesopotamia was about to shift. From the north, beyond the heartlands of and Uruk, came a man whose ambition would change the shape of history. His name was Sargon. Legends tell that Sargon was not born to royalty. Some say he was placed as an infant in a basket of reeds and set adrift upon the river, rescued and raised by a humble gardener. Whether true or myth, the story echoed the theme of destiny, that even the lowliest birth could conceal a fate written in the heavens. From those modest beginnings, Sargon rose through service. He became a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a trusted position close to power. But trust can turn to rivalry, and rivalry to ambition. In time, Sargon seized the throne, casting aside the king he once served. It was the first step in a path that would lead not only to Kish, but to every city between the rivers. Picture him in the early days of Conquest. His army marches beneath the blazing sun, sandals kicking dust into the air. Bronze weapons gleam, spears, axes, blades. Donkeys pull carts laden with supplies. Drums beat a steady rhythm, keeping soldiers in step as they move from one city to the next. Behind them, dust rises like a cloud, marking their passage. City after city fell to his power. Uruk, once the pride of kings, was brought beneath his rule. Ur, with its temples and markets, submitted to his authority. Nippur, Lagash, Umma, all the great names of Sumer came under his banner. By force and strategy, Sargon united the cities that had long quarrelled over land and water. For the first time, the many voices of Mesopotamia spoke under a single rule. This was the Akkadian Empire, the world's first true empire. From the Persian Gulf in the south to the Mediterranean in the west, Sargon's dominion stretched farther than any before him. The patchwork of city-states was bound together under one king, one army, one vision. It was a new idea, born of both ambition and necessity, that the river's wealth could flow farther if held in a single hand. But empire is more than conquest. Sargon established a system to hold what he had taken. He placed loyal governors over cities, ensuring taxes of grain, wool and silver flowed to his capital at Akkad. He stationed troops to keep order, their presence a reminder of the king's might. And through it all, he carried the aura of divine favor. In inscriptions, he claimed the goddess Ishtar had granted him victory, that the gods themselves had chosen him to rule the lands. Imagine the court at Akkad, bustling with scribes, officials, and envoys. Messengers arrive with tablets bearing news from distant provinces. A governor from Uruk kneels before the king, presenting jars of oil and wool as tribute. Soldiers stand guard at the palace gates, their armor catching the torchlight. In the great hall, Sargon sits upon a throne, his gaze steady, his presence commanding. Those who enter feel both awe and fear, for they stand before the man who has bound Mesopotamia into an empire. Yet even empires rest upon fragile foundations. To keep the cities loyal, Sargon relied on both strength and generosity. He redistributed grain in times of shortage, rewarded temples with offerings, and promoted Akkadian language alongside Sumerian. Slowly, scribes began to write not only in the old tongue of Sumer, but in Akkadian as well, blending cultures together. Trade flourished across the empire, timber from the Levant, metals from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Akkad became a hub, where goods, languages, and ideas flowed together like rivers joining the sea. Still, the people remembered their independence. The old city-states of Sumer had long histories of pride, each tied to its own gods and traditions. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Some accepted Akkadian rule as divine will. Others saw it as foreign domination. Rebellions flickered like sparks, quickly crushed but never fully extinguished. Pause for a moment and imagine the empire through the eyes of a farmer in Ur. He rises with the sun, tends his fields as always, but now he pays a portion of his grain not to local officials but to Akkadian governors. His prayers to Nana, god of the moon, remain unchanged, but his city now bows to a distant king he has never seen. For him, life is both the same and not the same, a reminder that empire is both vast and intimate, its reach felt even in the soil beneath his hands. Sargon reigned for decades, his name spreading far beyond the rivers. In later generations, kings would look back upon him as the model of power, the man who first showed what it meant to rule an empire. Yet, no empire lasts forever. After his death, his successors struggled to hold what he had built. Rebellions grew fiercer. Invaders pressed from the mountains and deserts. The great Akkadian empire, though mighty, was as mortal as its king. Within little more than a century, it began to crumble, its glory fading like dust blown across the plain. But the memory of Sargon endured. His story was told for centuries, painted in both admiration and fear. He became a figure of legend, the king who rose from nothing to command the world's first empire. His tale, like that of Gilgamesh, was a mirror in which people saw both the heights of ambition and the limits of human power. And so the rivers flowed on, carrying silt and memory together. The fields were sown, the ziggurats rose, the temples filled with prayers. Yet the shape of Mesopotamia had changed forever. No longer a land of small, quarreling cities, it had glimpsed the possibility of unity. An empire bound by conquest, administration, and vision. In time, new kings would rise to claim that vision. Laws would be carved into stone. Cities like Babylon would flourish, their names echoing even louder than Akkad's. But all would look back to Sargon, the gardener's child, the basket-born, the empire builder. His shadow stretched across the centuries, as enduring as the walls of Uruk, as unforgettable as the rivers themselves. The rivers fed the fields, the temples bound the people to their gods, and kings raised walls to guard their cities. Yet for all this strength, another force was needed to hold Mesopotamia together: law. For what use were harvests if neighbours quarrelled over canals? What good were markets if merchants cheated and trust dissolved? What meaning had power if injustice roamed unchecked? From the earliest days, priests and elders settled disputes beneath temple courtyards. They weighed claims, listened to witnesses, and swore oaths before the gods. But as cities grew larger, as trade stretched farther, as empires rose and fell, the need for clearer order became urgent. And it was Hammurabi, king of Babylon in the 18th century BCE, who gave that order its most lasting form. Hammurabi ruled a city that had grown from modest beginnings into one of Mesopotamia's brightest stars. Babylon, nestled on the Euphrates, thrived on trade and faith. Its streets were filled with merchants, its temples with worshippers, its fields with the labour of farmers. But Hammurabi saw that prosperity was fragile. Without justice, his city could not stand. And so he gathered the laws, some drawn from older traditions, others shaped anew, and set them down in stone. Imagine the scene as the great stele was unveiled, a pillar of black basalt, taller than a man, its surface carved with rows upon rows of cuneiform signs. At its top, a carved image, Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and lord of justice. The god extends to him the rod and ring, symbols of authority, as if to say that the laws below are not merely human, but divine. The people gather, staring up at the monument. Farmers with rough hands. Merchants still smelling of spice and wool. Children tugging at their mothers' robes. All look upon the king's words, carved not in fleeting clay but in enduring stone, a message for all time. The code contained hundreds of laws, covering nearly every corner of life. Some seem harsh to us now, demanding an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth. Others reveal a concern for fairness, that the strong should not oppress the weak, that debts should be managed, that workers should be paid. There were laws on trade, on property, on family, on crime. Laws for builders and farmers, for merchants and slaves, for husbands and wives. Each line sought to weave the chaos of daily life into a fabric of order. Picture a dispute in the marketplace. A merchant sells a jar of oil, but the buyer claims it is watered down. Voices rise, tempers flare. In earlier days, such a quarrel might end in violence or endless argument. But under Hammurabi's code, there is a path. Witnesses are called. The contract, if written, is read. If guilt is proven, the punishment is clear. The code does not erase conflict, but it channels it, giving both sides a ground on which to stand. For the farmer, the laws spoke of canals and fields. If a man neglected his dike and it broke, flooding a neighbour's land, he must repay the damage. If he borrowed seed but failed to harvest, he must return the debt in kind. Justice here was practical, tied to the earth itself, ensuring that negligence did not unravel the delicate balance of survival. For families too, the code set boundaries. Marriage was protected, but so was property. If disputes arose, judges could look to the laws for guidance. Inheritance, divorce, adoption, all were touched by Hammurabi's hand. The laws reflected the concerns of a society where family, property, and survival were bound together. The punishments were often severe, but they were also meant as deterrents. In a world where resources were scarce, where dishonesty could mean hunger or ruin, the threat of stern justice was a shield. To cheat in trade, to steal from a neighbour, to damage the canals, these were not small matters. They struck at the survival of all. Hammurabi's code reminded every citizen that actions carried weight, that life in community demanded responsibility. Yet, for all its strictness, the code also carried a spirit of protection. Hammurabi himself declared in its preface that he was chosen to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. Whether every law lived up to that vision is uncertain, but the intent was clear. Justice was not only about punishment, but about balance, about keeping society whole. Imagine a scribe reading the laws aloud in the marketplace, his voice carrying over the hum of the crowd. Farmers nod as they hear the lines about canals. Merchants listen closely to the rules on trade. Women glance at one another as the laws on family are spoken. Each person hears their life reflected in the words, their concerns acknowledged, their place in the great order affirmed. For the people of Babylon, the stele stood as more than stone. It was a promise that the king ruled not only with might, but with justice, that the gods themselves had sanctioned fairness, that even in a world of uncertainty, of floods, famine, and war, there was a structure, a guiding hand. And so Babylon thrived. Its walls grew stronger, its markets busier, its temples grander. The laws of Hammurabi gave it a spine, a framework upon which prosperity could grow. Other kings would follow, other empires would rise and fall, but the idea of written law endured. It was one of Mesopotamia's greatest gifts to the world, that justice could be carved into stone, that memory and fairness could outlast the breath of kings. As evening fell over Babylon, the basalt stele gleamed in the torchlight. Its rows of cuneiform signs caught the flicker of flame, their meaning etched forever into the earth. Around it, the city settled into its nightly rhythm. Merchants closing stalls, families gathering for supper, priests lighting lamps in the temples. And beneath it all lay the quiet assurance that order, however fragile, was held in words that could not be erased. The river still flowed, the fields still ripened, the Ziggurats still rose. But now the law stood as a third pillar, alongside faith and kingship, a voice carved in stone, speaking across generations, reminding all who passed. This is justice, this is order, this is the way of Babylon. This chapter will explore the legendary wonder of the Hanging Gardens, how it was described, the myths surrounding its creation, the daily life around its terraces, and its symbolic meaning. While historians still debate whether it truly existed, for our gentle bedtime story, we'll present it as it was imagined by ancient writers, lush, awe-inspiring, and filled with sensory detail. The city of Babylon was already a marvel of walls, temples, and markets. Its gates, faced with gleaming blue tiles and roaring lions in relief, proclaimed both power and splendor. But there was one marvel spoken of in hushed tones across the ancient world, a wonder so unusual that travelers carried its story to distant lands. This was the Hanging Gardens. Legends tell that the gardens were built by a great king, perhaps Nebuchadnezzar II, as a gift to his queen, who longed for the green hills and forests of her distant homeland. In the flat plains of Mesopotamia, where the horizon stretched wide and open, she missed the mountains of her youth. To ease her sorrow, the king commanded that a mountain be raised within the city itself, not of stone and earth, but of terraces overflowing with life. Imagine approaching Babylon on a clear day. The Euphrates glitters in the sun, the walls of the city rise high and proud, and above them, something extraordinary comes into view. A cascade of greenery spilling downward from tier upon tier of stone. Trees reach skyward, their branches heavy with fruit. Vines trail from terraces, their leaves shimmering in the light. From afar, it seems as though a forest floats above the rooftops, suspended in the air. The gardens were said to rise like steps toward the heavens, each level supported by massive stone arches. Upon these terraces, soil was laid deep, enough to root trees and shrubs. Ingenious systems of irrigation lifted water from the river below, carrying it upward through hidden channels, ensuring that every leaf remained green, even under the blazing Mesopotamian sun. Streams trickled through stone channels, cooling the air. The scent of blossoms carried on the breeze. Step closer, and the wonder only deepens. On one terrace, palms spread wide, their fronds casting cool shade. Beneath them, figs and pomegranates hang ripe, their sweetness filling the air. On another, roses bloom, their petals bright against the stone. Grapevines twine around wooden trellises, heavy with clusters of fruit. Water splashes softly into basins where lilies float. Birds nest among the branches, their songs mingling with the murmur of flowing water. For the people of Babylon, the gardens were more than beauty. They were a symbol of abundance, of power over nature itself. To raise a mountain of greenery in the heart of the city was to declare that even the desert could be conquered, that human hands could command rivers and earth to obey. The gardens spoke of a king's devotion, but also of the might of Babylon, a city so wealthy, so skilled, that it could create paradise where none should exist. Picture a summer evening on the terraces. The heat of the day has softened, and the air is filled with the fragrance of jasmine and myrtle. Couples stroll along shaded paths, their sandals brushing against stone warmed by the sun. Children laugh as they chase each other among the columns. Musicians play soft melodies on lyres, their notes drifting upward into the twilight. And above it all, the queen herself may walk, her heart eased by the sight of mountains reborn in the plains, her sorrow transformed into joy. The Hanging Gardens became legend, counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Travellers from Greece wrote of them in awe, their descriptions painting pictures of marvels beyond imagination. Some claimed they were built not in Babylon, but in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital to the north. Others doubted whether they ever existed at all. The earth has yielded no ruins certain to be theirs, no stones that whisper their secret. Yet the story endures, because in it lies a truth beyond stone. The human longing to create beauty, to turn memory into living form. For the Babylonians, the gardens were not simply pleasure. They were part of a world-view in which order triumphed over chaos, in which the city mirrored the universe. Just as the ziggurat rose as a stairway to heaven, so too did the gardens bring heaven's beauty down to earth. They were a reminder that life could flourish even in the harshest of lands, that water and soil, guided by human hands, could become paradise. And in their shade, daily life unfolded. Servants carried water jars along hidden corridors, feeding the ingenious machinery that lifted water skyward. Gardeners tended vines and pruned trees, their hands stained with earth. Children plucked fruit fresh from the branches, juice running down their chins. Priests paused to give thanks for the abundance, murmuring prayers to Ishtar, to Shamash, to Ea, gods of love, sun, and water. Each act, whether simple or sacred, was part of the rhythm of life within the green heart of Babylon. As night fell, the terraces glowed with torchlight. Shadows of leaves danced upon the stone walls, flickering with each flame. The sound of trickling water continued in the darkness, steady and soft, like the heartbeat of the city itself. Above, the stars shone bright, mirrored in the pools that dotted the gardens. Perhaps the queen herself sat beneath the branches, gazing upward, her soul at peace. Whether they truly stood as the ancients described, or whether they lived only in memory and imagination, the Hanging Gardens remain a symbol of what Mesopotamia aspired to be. A place where human skill and divine inspiration met, where beauty could rise from dust, where longing could be transformed into wonder. And so the legend endures, carried on the winds of time. The rivers still flowed, the fields still ripened, the temples still reached skyward. But above it all, in the stories whispered by travellers, in the dreams of poets and kings, the Hanging Gardens still bloomed, forever green in the memory of the world. Beneath the towering ziggurats, beside the glittering temples, and under the shadow of Babylon's legendary gardens, another rhythm pulsed through Mesopotamia, the rhythm of trade. For all the power of kings, for all the splendor of palaces, it was merchants and markets that carried the lifeblood of the cities. The land between the rivers was rich in soil and water, yet it lacked many of the resources needed for greatness. There were no forests broad enough to supply endless timber, no mountains within reach to yield copper, tin, or gold. And so, from the earliest days, Mesopotamians turned outward, their eyes on the horizons, seeking what they could not find at home. Out of this need grew roads, caravans, and voyages that stretched across deserts, seas, and mountains. Picture the marketplace of on a busy morning. Stalls line the square, shaded with woven mats. The smell of roasting bread mingles with the tang of fish brought fresh from the river. Clay jars of beer stand ready, their tops sealed with reeds. Merchants call out their wares, barley and wheat stacked in baskets, dates glistening in the sun, wool dyed in vivid colours. Donkeys bray as they are loaded with goods, their backs swaying beneath sacks of grain or rolls of cloth. The air buzzes with voices, with haggling, with the clink of copper coins and silver weights. And beyond the local goods lie treasures from far away. From the mountains of Anatolia come copper and tin, melted together to make bronze, the metal of tools, weapons, and progress. From the distant shores of the Persian Gulf arrive shells, polished into ornaments, their pearly glow catching the light. From the deserts to the west, caravans bring blocks of lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone prized like the night sky itself. Timber arrives from Lebanon, its tall cedars carried downriver to build temples and palaces. Every item tells a story, every basket and jar a sign of roads that stretch far beyond the city walls. Imagine a caravan leaving Babylon at dawn. Donkeys are laden with grain and wool, their sides covered with woven nets to hold the loads steady. Merchants walk beside them, cloaks wrapped tight against the morning chill, staffs in hand. Ahead lies the desert, a vast plain of heat and silence. The road is long, but they know the way, marked by wells and resting stations. By night, they camp under the stars, the air filled with the soft crunch of bread and the murmur of trade agreements spoken around the fire. Days later, they arrive in distant lands, their goods exchanged for metals, stones, and timber. And then the long road home begins, the promise of profit pulling them forward. Trade was not only about goods, it was about connection. As merchants moved, so too did stories, songs, and ideas. Languages mingled in the markets, Akkadian words blending with tongues from distant coasts. Techniques travelled. A new style of pottery here, a new way of weaving there. Even beliefs spread along the trade routes, gods of one land sometimes finding shrines in another. In this way, Mesopotamia became not only a receiver of wealth but a crossroads of culture. Pause for a moment and step into the life of a single merchant. His name is lost to time, but we can imagine him standing at his stall, weighing silver on a balance scale. His hands are calloused from travel, his cloak patched from years of use. Yet his eyes are sharp, scanning the crowd for buyers, listening for whispers of new caravans, new opportunities. Behind him, jars of oil gleam in the sun. Beside him, a bundle of lapis lies hidden under cloth, a treasure meant for a noble's necklace or a priest's offering. He lives between journeys, part trader, part storyteller, part dreamer, always looking to the horizon. The temples too played their role. They were not only houses of gods, but also storehouses of wealth. Grain collected as offerings was redistributed in lean years. Silver weighed in the temple vaults financed trade expeditions. Priests kept records of contracts and debts, their clay tablets the lifeblood of the economy. Religion and commerce walked hand in hand, each strengthening the other. And in the palaces, kings encouraged the flow of trade, for it brought both wealth and prestige. A ruler who could adorn his temples with cedar beams, his queens with lapis jewels, his soldiers with bronze weapons, displayed not only power, but the reach of his influence. Trade was empire in another form, softer than armies, but just as binding. Imagine the docks along the Euphrates at dusk. Boats arrive heavy with cargo, their hulls creaking as men unload baskets and jars. The river glimmers in the fading light, reflecting the glow of torches along the shore. Fishermen mend their nets nearby. Children splash in the shallows, while merchants oversee the unloading, checking each item against their lists. The air smells of water and wood, of spices carried on the evening breeze. The city hums with life, nourished by goods from lands far beyond the horizon. Trade shaped daily life as deeply as faith or law. A clay tablet listing debts tells of a farmer who borrowed seed for his field. Another tablet records the wages of a worker paid in silver for carrying goods. Seals, carved with intricate designs, were pressed into clay to mark ownership, their symbols as unique as signatures today. In each mark and weight, one sees the delicate dance of trust and exchange that kept the great cities alive. And through it all, the merchants remained the quiet travelers of civilization. Their steps wore paths across the desert. Their boats traced lines upon the rivers. Their voices filled the markets. Their hands passed goods from one to another, weaving a web of connection that stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean. The hanging gardens may have been legend, the Ziggurats symbols of faith, the laws carved in stone. But without the merchants, without the hum of trade and the shimmer of distant goods, Mesopotamia would have remained a cluster of cities, bound to their rivers alone. It was commerce that opened the land between the rivers to the wider world, that carried its influence outward, and that brought back the treasures that made its cities shine. As the night settles over Babylon, the markets grow quiet. Stalls are packed away, jars sealed, donkeys tethered. Yet even in silence, the roads remain, stretching outward like veins into the dark. Tomorrow, they will fill again with voices, with goods, with stories. And the merchants will walk once more, carrying with them not only the wealth of Mesopotamia, but its soul. The markets of Babylon still hummed with the voices of merchants, the fields still rippled with barley, and the rivers still whispered their song. Yet to the north, another power stirred, a kingdom of warriors and builders whose ambition reached farther than any before. This was Assyria, the storm of Mesopotamia. High on the banks of the Tigris, the city of Ashur gave its name to both god and kingdom. From here, the Assyrians began as traders, their ships drifting down the river, their caravans moving through Anatolia in search of tin and silver. But trade alone could not contain their energy. Slowly, steadily, Assyria transformed from a modest city-state into a force that would thunder across the ancient world. Their strength lay first in their armies. Assyria learned to fight with discipline and innovation. Soldiers marched in ordered ranks, their shields locked together, their spears gleaming in the sun. Chariots rumbled across the plains, wheels kicking up dust, horses straining against their harnesses. Archers loosed volleys of arrows, their bowstrings snapping in rhythm. Behind them came siege engines, towers on wheels, battering rams tipped with bronze, inventions that allowed them to breach the proudest of walls. To their neighbours, the Assyrian army seemed unstoppable, a tide of iron and will. Yet this storm was not only destruction, it was also organization. The Assyrians built roads to move their armies swiftly, but those same roads carried merchants and messages. They developed a postal system, relays of riders galloping from one station to the next, carrying news across vast distances. In this way, their empire held together, bound by speed and communication. Imagine a rider leaving Nineveh at dawn, his horse steaming in the chill morning air. In his hand, he carries a tablet sealed with the king's mark. By midday, he reaches the next station, where another rider waits. Without pause, the message is passed on, and the second horse gallops away. Day and night the system continues, carrying the king's words faster than any army could march. To rule such a vast empire, the Assyrians mastered not only the sword but the word. Their kings were fierce but also ambitious builders. In Ashur, in Kalhu, in Nineveh, they raised palaces vast and glittering. Walls stretched for miles, adorned with reliefs carved in stone. These reliefs told stories of battles won, of lions hunted, of tribute brought by distant lands. Imagine walking through the great halls of Nineveh, the walls alive with images, soldiers wading through rivers, chariots charging, kings standing tall, their faces serene even amidst conquest. Torches flicker across the carvings, the shadows making the figures seem to move, as if the walls themselves breathe with history. And within these palaces lay treasures of knowledge. The kings of Assyria collected texts from across Mesopotamia, copying them onto clay tablets, preserving them in great libraries. In Nineveh, the library of Ashurbanipal grew into a wonder of its own. Tens of thousands of tablets filled with hymns, myths, medical texts, astronomical records, and epics. It was here that the story of Gilgamesh was preserved, carried forward to us through the patience of scribes who pressed each sign into clay. Pause here and picture that library. Shelves of clay tablets stacked in neat rows, each one heavy in the hand, yet light with meaning. scribes moving quietly, selecting tablets, copying them carefully by torchlight. Outside, the empire may rage with battle and conquest, but within these walls lies another kind of power, the power of memory, of knowledge saved for generations to come. For all their might, the Assyrians were also deeply tied to their gods. Ashur, the warrior deity, stood at the center of their faith, but they honored many others: Ishtar, Shamash, Nabu. Temples rose beside palaces, smoke curling upward from altars. Prayers murmured in the dawn. Even the storm of empire needed the blessing of the heavens. But empires, like rivers, rise and fall. Assyria's strength bred both awe and resentment. Subject peoples chafed under its demands for tribute, its heavy hand in governance. Rebellions flared like sparks in dry grass. Enemies gathered at its borders, waiting for weakness. By the late 7th century BCE, the storm that had rolled across Mesopotamia began to falter. A coalition of Babylonians and Medes marched upon Nineveh, and the great city fell in fire. The palaces crumbled, the reliefs were buried in ash, the library scattered. And yet, the Assyrians left a legacy that outlived their empire. Their innovations in warfare, in administration, in communication shaped the world that followed. Their art still speaks in stone, their libraries still whisper in clay. Even their reputation, fierce as it was, ensured their memory. For who could forget the storm that once swept across the land? Imagine standing upon the ruins of Nineveh at twilight. The Tigris flows quietly nearby, its waters golden in the fading sun. Around you lie broken walls, scattered bricks, fragments of carved stone. The storm has passed, but the air still feels heavy with echoes. In the silence, you can almost hear the tramp of soldiers, the whinny of horses, the scratch of styluses in clay. Empires fade, but their voices remain, carried forward like dust on the wind. And so the rivers flowed on, the fields still ripened, the people still prayed. But now, in the wake of the Assyrian storm, new powers stirred, and Babylon once again prepared to rise, brighter, prouder, and more enduring than before. The storm of Assyria had passed. Its walls lay broken, its palaces silent, its libraries buried in ash. Yet from the ruins, another power rose, one that would shine as brightly as any before. Babylon, ancient city of temples and markets, lifted its head once more. And at its heart stood a king whose name would be remembered for centuries, Nebuchadnezzar II. To speak of Nebuchadnezzar is to speak of grandeur. Under his rule, beginning in the 6th century BCE, Babylon was reborn as the jewel of Mesopotamia. Its walls rose taller and stronger. Its temples gleamed with new splendor. Its streets filled with the hum of life renewed. If earlier kings had shaped Babylon into a city of promise, Nebuchadnezzar shaped it into a wonder of the world. Imagine approaching Babylon during his reign. The desert stretches silent around you, and then, suddenly, the walls appear on the horizon. Massive, shimmering in the sun, stretching farther than the eye can see. These were not simple fortifications, but monumental barriers, wide enough for chariots to ride upon their tops. Gates punctuated the walls, each one a triumph of art and symbolism. Most famous of all was the Ishtar Gate, faced with deep blue glazed bricks, its surface alive with lions, bulls, and dragons in radiant relief. To walk through it was to step from the dust of the desert into the heart of a city that seemed almost divine. Inside, The avenues stretched broad and straight, lined with processional ways paved in stone. During festivals, statues of the gods were carried down these roads, their presence honored by priests, nobles, and crowds of worshippers. Flowers and incense filled the air, music echoed from flutes and drums, and the entire city seemed to move as one, caught in the rhythm of devotion and pride. At the center stood the great Ziggurat of Babylon, known to later generations as the Tower of Babel. It rose tier upon tier, each level painted in vivid colors, each stairway leading upward toward the heavens. At its summit, a shrine awaited, said to be the dwelling place of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. To climb its steps was to ascend from the mortal world toward the divine, to feel the city itself stretch between earth and sky. Picture the temple courts alive with activity. Priests in white robes carry offerings of bread, wine, and incense. Musicians play hymns, their melodies rising like prayers into the air. Scribes record the rituals on clay tablets, their hands moving swiftly as the ceremonies unfold. Citizens gather at the edges, heads bowed, their voices murmuring with the chants. The smell of burning incense mingles with the fragrance of flowers brought as offerings, filling the air with a sense of sacred stillness. But Babylon was more than ritual. It was also a place of daily abundance. Markets brimmed with goods from every corner of the empire. Merchants sold spices and wool, timber and stone, fish and fruit. Artisans shaped jewelry of gold and lapis, carved statues of gods and animals, painted bricks in bright glazes. Families filled the courtyards of their homes. Children played in the streets. Storytellers recited myths in the squares. For all its grandeur, the city also pulsed with the simple joys of human life. Nebuchadnezzar himself was remembered not only as a builder, but as a ruler of great ambition. He expanded Babylon's reach, defending its borders and ensuring its dominance over Mesopotamia. He rebuilt temples not only in Babylon, but in cities across the land, restoring ancient sanctuaries to their former glory. His devotion to Marduk, his city's god, was expressed not only in prayers, but in bricks and stone, each structure a monument to both faith and power. And perhaps, in the midst of this glory, the hanging gardens bloomed once more. Whether legend or truth, they remained a symbol of Nebuchadnezzar's devotion, his desire to turn the flat plains into paradise. Terraces of green, watered by hidden channels, rising above the rooftops like a mountain conjured from memory. If they stood, their shade offered rest to both king and people, their beauty a reminder that even in the heat of the plain, life could flourish in abundance. Pause for a moment and imagine walking through Babylon at twilight. The sun has set, and the walls glow with the fading light. The Ishtar Gate shines with its blue tiles, torchlight reflecting off the golden figures of lions and dragons. The air is alive with voices, merchants closing their stalls, priests singing the last hymns of the day, families sharing meals in their courtyards. From the Ziggurat, the last rays of the sun catch the shrine at its summit, making it glow like a star against the darkening sky. For those who lived here, it must have felt as though they stood at the very center of the world. Yet even Babylon's grandeur was not eternal. To the east, the Persians gathered strength, their empire rising like the dawn. In time, Babylon would fall beneath their power, its walls breached, its kings dethroned. But in Nebuchadnezzar's day, none of this was yet written. In his day, Babylon was unmatched, a beacon of culture, faith, and wonder. The memory of Nebuchadnezzar and his city endured long after its stones crumbled, in stories and scriptures, in ruins uncovered by later hands, his name lives on. Babylon became a symbol of greatness, of ambition, of the fleeting nature of human power. Its gardens still bloom in imagination, its gates still gleam in story, its Ziggurats still rises in the minds of those who whisper of towers that touched the sky. And so the rivers flowed as they always had. The barley ripened, the markets bustled, the temples rang with song. But above it all, Babylon stood radiant, crowned by the vision of a king who sought to make his city not only a place of power, but a reflection of paradise itself. The ziggurat of Babylon still rose tier upon tier, its summit catching the first light of dawn. The Ishtar Gate still gleamed with blue tiles, lions and dragons striding proudly across its surface. In the markets, merchants still called out their wares, children still played in the courtyards, priests still raised prayers in the temples. To the people of Babylon, life seemed as eternal as the flow of the Euphrates. Yet beyond the horizon, change was coming. From the east, across mountains and plains, another power gathered strength, the Persians. Led by Cyrus the Great, their empire stretched farther with every season, swallowing kingdoms, cities, and lands into its embrace. Unlike storms of the past, this was not a power that came and went in sudden fury. It was steady, deliberate, inevitable. In 539 BCE, its gaze turned toward Babylon. The city was mighty, its walls towering, its gates strong. Within those walls, people trusted in their defenses, in the grandeur of their temples, in the favor of Marduk, their great god. But empires do not fall only by force of arms. They falter when the hearts of their people grow weary, when the balance between ruler and ruled slips into discord. Nebuchadnezzar's successors had not matched his vision. Discontent lingered, whispering in the streets, echoing in the shadows. When Cyrus marched his armies toward Babylon, the earth itself seemed to shift. Imagine the steady tramp of soldiers, the glint of bronze beneath the sun, the banners snapping in the wind. Yet the city did not meet them with the fury of resistance. Instead, the Persians entered with swiftness and calm. The gates opened without great struggle. Babylon, the city of wonders, had fallen not in fire, but in surrender. For the Babylonians, the moment must have felt surreal. One evening, their city was theirs. The next, it belonged to another. Yet Cyrus came not as a destroyer, but as a ruler who sought harmony. He proclaimed respect for Babylon's gods, even entering the temples to honor Marduk. He freed captives taken in earlier wars, allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands. To some, his arrival felt less like conquest and more like renewal, a change of hands rather than a breaking of the city's spirit. Still, something shifted. Babylon remained grand, its walls intact, its temples alive with ritual. But it was no longer the center of power, no longer the beating heart of an empire. Instead, it became one jewel among many in the Persian crown, a province in a realm that stretched farther than Mesopotamians had ever dreamed. From the valleys of the Indus to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the mountains of Anatolia to the sands of Egypt. Pause and imagine Babylon in those years. The streets are as busy as ever, the markets filled, the ziggurat still rising proudly above the rooftops. But above the city gates now hang the banners of Persia. Officials speak in new tongues, edicts carry the seal of a distant king. The people live as they always have, sowing barley, weaving wool, offering prayers, Yet beneath the surface lies a quiet recognition. Babylon is no longer the center of the world. The fading dawn of Mesopotamia was not a sudden darkness, but a gentle dimming. The traditions continued. Scribes still pressed cuneiform into clay. Priests still sang hymns. Builders still laid brick upon brick. But slowly, other languages began to dominate. Other rulers claimed the spotlight. The brilliance of Mesopotamia, though not extinguished, began to merge into the broader glow of Persia's vast empire. And yet, even as political power shifted, the spirit of Mesopotamia endured. The knowledge preserved in its libraries was copied and carried forward. Its myths of Gilgamesh, of floods and gods, found echoes in new cultures. Its innovations in law, writing, and governance continued to shape lands far beyond the rivers. The Persians themselves honored what they inherited, weaving Mesopotamian traditions into their own fabric. Picture a quiet evening on the Euphrates after the Conquest. Farmers return from the fields, their donkeys laden with sheaves of barley. The air smells of baking bread, of smoke rising from hearths. Children laugh as they chase one another along the banks. Across the water, the walls of Babylon glow in the sunset, unchanged in their grandeur. And yet, the people know the truth. The age of their empire has passed. A new dawn belongs to Persia, while theirs lingers only in memory. History moves in waves. The Sumerians had risen first, carving canals and prayers into clay. The Akkadians had built the first empire. The Babylonians had etched laws into stone. The Assyrians had thundered like storms, then fallen. Babylon had risen anew in splendor, only to be folded into Persia's embrace. Each age left its mark. Each dawn gave way to another. The rivers flowed on, carrying silt, carrying memory, carrying the echoes of all who lived along their banks. And so, in the days of Cyrus, the cradle of civilization no longer rocked alone. It became part of something vaster, a world of empires, each building upon the stones of the last. Mesopotamia's dawn had faded, but its light had not vanished. It lingered, soft and enduring, in every field sown, every prayer whispered, every story told beneath the stars. The rivers still flow, winding through the plains as they have for millennia. The Tigris and the Euphrates continue their endless journey, carrying silt and memory, nourishing fields, whispering their ancient song. Yet the great cities that once rose upon their banks now lie quiet. Their walls tumbled, their ziggurats crumbled, their markets silent. The glory of Mesopotamia rests beneath the sand. Uruk, once the first metropolis, is but a scattering of ruins, its proud walls long gone. Home of kings and temples, lies hushed, its ziggurat a weathered mound against the horizon. Babylon, once crowned with gates of blue and gardens of green, has faded into dust. Nineveh, once alive with the storm of Assyria, lies buried beneath fields where shepherds graze their flocks. The cities that shaped civilization now sleep, their voices faint but not forgotten, for their echoes remain, in shards of pottery uncovered by patient hands, in tablets of clay pressed with wedge-shaped signs, telling of trade and prayers, of floods and kings, in myths copied and recopied, carrying the voices of Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and Inanna, in laws carved into stone, reminding us of justice sought long ago. Every fragment, every mark is a whisper from the past, carried across thousands of years. Imagine an archaeologist in the quiet desert, brushing sand away from a tablet buried for millennia. The clay feels cool in the morning air, its surface etched with cuneiform signs. Slowly, carefully, the marks emerge, and with them, a voice speaks again. A contract for barley, a hymn to a god, a story of a flood. The tablet may be small, its signs faint, but in it lives the heartbeat of a civilization. Through such discoveries, Mesopotamia speaks to us still. We learn of their daily lives, of farmers sowing barley, of merchants haggling in markets, of children shaping clay toys with their hands. We learn of their dreams, of gods who strode the heavens, of heroes who sought immortality, of gardens raised to ease the sorrow of a queen. We learn of their wisdom, of laws written for fairness, of libraries gathered for knowledge, of temples built to bridge earth and sky. Their legacy is vast, woven into our own lives in ways we may not always see. The concept of writing, born in their clay tablets, gave humanity its memory. The idea of laws written and preserved gave order to societies across the world. Their stories of floods, of towers, of quests for meaning echo in the myths and scriptures of later ages. Even the way we measure time, the 60 minutes of an hour, the 12 months of a year, carries the imprint of Mesopotamia's thought. Pause and consider how much of the world we know rests on the foundation they laid. Every book you read, every word written, traces back to the stylus pressing clay in Uruk. Every law carved into codes and constitutions recalls Hammurabi's stele. Every tale of a hero facing mortality finds a shadow in Gilgamesh's journey. The echoes of Mesopotamia are not distant. They are beneath our every step, woven into the fabric of human life. And yet, there is something humbling in their silence. For all their grandeur, their walls fell. For all their power, their kings are dust. For all their devotion, their temples crumble. Time has carried them away, as it will one day carry us. But perhaps that is the lesson Mesopotamia offers most clearly, that our lives, though fleeting, can shape what follows, that our words and deeds may echo beyond us, carried forward in ways we cannot imagine. Picture, once more, standing on the banks of the Euphrates at dusk. The water glimmers in the fading light. The air is warm, still carrying the scent of earth and reeds. In the distance, the ruins of Babylon lie quiet, their outlines softened by shadow. The ziggurat is no longer whole, the gardens no longer bloom, the gates no longer shine. Yet, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The hum of the marketplace, the beat of drums, the chant of priests, the laughter of children. For though the city sleeps, its spirit remains, woven into the memory of humanity. The cradle of civilization has rocked the world. From reed huts to temples, from kings to empires, from myths to laws, Mesopotamia gave birth to the patterns of life we still know today. Its dawn may have faded, but its light endures, glowing softly beneath the sands, waiting for each generation to uncover anew. And so we end where we began, between two rivers, where reeds sway in the breeze and waters shimmer beneath the sky. Here, the first cities rose. Here, the first words were written. Here, humanity learned to build, to dream, to remember. The story of Mesopotamia is not only their story, it is ours. So now, let the night grow still. Let the rivers whisper their eternal song. And may the echoes of this ancient land carry you gently into rest, reminding you that every dawn leaves its trace, every life its mark, every story its echo beneath the sand. Sleep well.